Greetings. During the Middle Ages, the peoples of Europe encountered a new, unprecedented illness. Its victims began to suffer from sensations of crawling skin, nausea, and headaches, followed by sharp, burning pains. They were described as an internal fire rapidly leading to the blackening and necrosis of limbs. According to a chronicler who documented the epidemic of 1090, many rotted alive under the influence of the sacred fire, which consumed their insides, and the burnt limbs turned as black as coal. People died a miserable death, and those whom it spared were doomed to an even more miserable life with amputated arms and legs. Since the disease was accompanied by intense internal heat or muscular spasms, it was called the fire of St. Anthony, or the witch's hex. The first documented mention of this disease dates back to the year 857, and thereafter epidemics occurred with alarming regularity. In the epidemic of 994 in France, over 40,000 people perished. In the 11th century, large-scale epidemics occurred in 1043 and 1094. Chroniclers note that in Regensburg alone, over 8,000 residents died in just 12 weeks, while small villages were nearly wiped out. In this year, the epidemic spread across Germany, the Netherlands, France, Burgundy, and Italy. In the following century, significant epidemics were recorded in 1109 and 1128, with Paris alone witnessing the death of 14,000 people during this latter epidemic. Outbreaks of the disease occurred regularly, and it wasn't until 1670 that the cause of the disease became known. The French physician Louis Tuillier determined that the fire of St. Anthony was not an infectious disease, but was caused by consuming rye, contaminated with ergot. Ergot is a type of fungus that parasitizes rye. Grains affected by the fungus take on the shape of curved horns, ranging in color from light brown to purple brown. Consumption of bread made from grain contaminated with ergot caused outbreaks of ergotism. Two forms of this disease are distinguished: convulsive and gangrenous. The first form, convulsive, is characterized by spasms of various muscle groups. It began with numbness and tingling in the fingertips, nausea and vomiting, and manifested as severe spasms of skeletal muscles, accompanied to a greater or lesser extent by paralysis and loss of sensation. It was referred to as the witch's hex in the Middle Ages. The second form is characterized by muscle contractions and tissue necrosis. Patients began to suffer from sensations of crawling skin, nausea, and headaches, followed by sharp, burning pains, perceived by the patient as an internal fire, leading to the necrosis of limbs. Gangrene most often affects the lower rather than upper limbs. It spreads from bottom to top. Additionally, the progression of the disease in its gangrenous form caused severe hallucinations. Moreover, these hallucinations afflicted both the sick and outwardly healthy individuals because the hallucinogenic properties of ergot occur even with the intake of insignificant doses. People saw hordes of demons tormenting them, witches, devils, various catastrophes. The visions were so vivid that during the witch hunts, many admitted to themselves, convinced that they were truly communicating with evil forces. This is precisely why the disease was named the Fire of St. Anthony, after the saint of the 3 Ard 4 the centuries, as his life is filled with descriptions of his temptations by demons. Here is a fragment from his life. Once a demon knocked on the monastery gates. Stepping out, I saw before me a huge giant whose head seemed to reach the sky. But I spat in his mouth in response, and, invoking the name of Christ, rushed at him, raising my hand to strike, and, as it seemed, struck, and at the name of Christ the giant immediately disappeared with all his demons. It was natural for the treatment of the fire of St. Anthony to be conducted in the name of this saint. In 1089, a wealthy French nobleman, Gaston de Valois, who had prayed for the healing of his son before the image of St. Anthony, founded a monastic charitable community for the treatment of ergotism. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II approved the statute of the Hospital Brotherhood of St. Anthony, and more than 370 hospitals for the sick were built in the name of St. Anthony. The sick sought healing through the relics of St. Anthony, but most importantly, the bread baked by the monastery residents was made from wheat, not rye, contaminated with ergot. Therefore, those sheltered within the protective walls of the monastery hospital ceased to receive daily doses of poison and often recovered. However, returning to their usual diet could trigger the disease again in the recovered individual. In ancient times, the main grains used in bread making were wheat and barley, which were almost immune to ergot contamination. Rye at that time was considered merely a weed contaminating wheat fields. However, in northern European countries, and in what is now Russia, wheat often failed to thrive, and gradually its hardier companion weed evolved into an independent crop. In the Middle Ages, due to its resilience to soil conditions, low maintenance requirements, resistance to weeds, and lesser fussiness compared to wheat, rye became the most widespread grain. Peasants almost universally consumed dark rye bread. Wheat became the grain for the chosen few, and white bread was reserved almost exclusively for noble and princely tables. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh. Extremely primitive agriculture led to peasants having a meager diet. Peasants primarily subsisted on rye bread, porridge, and vegetables, rarely having meat and often not eating their fill. During communal festivities, they ate the same food but in larger quantities. Every 5 years there was crop failure and hunger, and every 30 years a great famine occurred. Here is a description of the famine that struck France in 1030. Swiftly exhausting all kinds of game, beasts and birds, people resorted to eating corpses and all sorts of things that it is terrible to mention. Forest roots did not save from hunger, and people became game. A true hunt began. Travelers fleeing hunger were stopped on the roads, killed, chopped into pieces, and roasted. Others were killed and eaten at night by those who had provided them shelter. Children, seeing from afar a lure in the form of an egg or an apple, ran up in hopes of getting food, and themselves became the food. Many people extracted white clay-like soil from the ground, mixed it with a little flour or bran, and baked bread from this mixture, believing that this would save them from starvation. But it only brought them hope for salvation and deceptive relief. Pale, emaciated faces and swollen bellies were everywhere, and the human voice became thin, resembling the feeble cry of dying birds. Those who did not die from hunger became victims of numerous diseases caused by consuming poor quality food. It was during famine years, due to the peculiarities of natural conditions, low temperatures, excessively high or abnormally low humidity, that there was severe contamination of crops by ergot, leading to another outbreak of the disease. This disease has not spared humanity in the modern and contemporary periods either. Up to 1789, there were 132 epidemics of ergotism recorded. The last case of mass ergotism occurred in 1951 in the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in France. Here, bread made from flour contaminated with ergot was baked in one of the bakeries, and more than 300 people bought this bread. Many people experienced hallucinations. They felt as if terrifying creatures were attacking them, and fiery spheres were falling from the sky. Residents tore off their clothes and ran naked through the streets. Eventually, the village was surrounded by gendarmes, and straitjackets were put on the most unruly individuals, with treatment organized. Unfortunately, 4 people could not be saved. The initial assumption was mercury poisoning, but after laboratory tests revealed ergot alkaloids in the bread, the diagnosis of ergotism was established. This disease has not spared humanity in the modern and contemporary periods either. Up to 1789, there were 132 epidemics of ergotism recorded. The last case of mass ergotism occurred in 1951 in the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in France. Here, bread made from flour contaminated with ergot was baked in one of the bakeries, and more than 300 people bought this bread. Many people experienced hallucinations. They felt as if terrifying creatures were attacking them, and fiery spheres were falling from the sky. Residents tore off their clothes and ran naked through the streets. Eventually, the village was surrounded by gendarmes, and straitjackets were put on the most unruly individuals, with treatment organized. Unfortunately, 4 people could not be saved. The initial assumption was mercury poisoning, but after laboratory tests revealed ergot alkaloids in the bread, the diagnosis of ergotism was established.